Hey there, Colin Marshall here, host of the Marketplace of Ideas, letting you know that if there's anybody you'd like to hear interviewed on this program, by all means, all guest suggestions are welcome at colin@colinmarshallradio.com. Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with electro-acoustic musician and old technology enthusiast Ethan Rose, whose new album, Oaks, was recorded almost entirely with the aid of a vintage 1920s Wurlitzer organ. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Ethan Rose is an electronic musician and sound installation artist whose work, you might say, explores the more acoustic side of electronic music. His new album, called Oaks, is available from Holocene Records. Ethan, welcome to the program.
Thanks a lot.
This is a record, a piece of music that is very, you might say, geographically grounded, at least if you're going to go by the basis that you read about in reviews and such. Tell us a little bit about Oaks Park in Portland, the namesake of this album, and what's there?
Well, Oaks itself is an old amusement park. I think it's actually the oldest operating amusement park in the country. It's been in continuous operation for over 100 years. It's kind of a bizarre and sort of strange place that I think if you live in Portland long enough, you end up going there at some point. And I had been there a few years ago for a friend of mine, kind of on a lark, had his birthday party there. They have a roller rink. It's also about 100 years old. And inside of the rink, there's a theater organ, which has been, it's been moved from its original location, so it's been there since the 50s. But when I first saw the organ, I was totally amazed by it, and it was being performed on by a organist named Keith Fortune, and I knew at that point that I wanted to do something, but it just took me a couple of years to be able to find the time to approach it.
Now, Portland is a city I really enjoy, and I've been there a bunch of times. I've never lived there, though. Is Oaks the kind of place that you only go when you've been around there a while? Because it doesn't seem to be... I don't talk to many visitors who have been there.
Yeah, no, I think it's like, it's definitely kind of a little bit off the beaten path, and it's sort of a strange place in a lot of ways. It's got this history, but it's also been rebuilt and changed over the years. So the history is somewhat buried. It's a little kind of run down in certain ways, but that also kind of gives it a little bit of charm. But I think that it's not really a destination. It's sort of at least not for people that would be traveling here. It's more of a sort of a local highlight for people that have been here for a while and just kind of want to go try something new that the area has to offer.
All that said about how I haven't been there while visiting before, I definitely am going to make the journey the next time I'm in Portland, because it sounds like there's a lot of different eras all put in that one place, because I think of a skating rink, and usually when I see them in other areas, it's like they're like bowling alleys. They were frozen somewhere in the late 70s and just never changed. But this sounds like a bunch of eras besides that all put together. Am I right or wrong there?
No, yeah, that's definitely nailed it, especially for the rink. I mean, the rink itself, you can tell is old when you get in there, and have all these historic photographs, so you can kind of live the history. And the floor is a really highly prized skating floor. I found all this out after I'd been there for a while. So I had no idea that there was even really much of a skating community as far as roller skating goes, but there is. And Oaks turns out to be one of the sort of best. I think it's one of the best floors in the country in terms of roller skating. So the place itself also kind of houses this whole roller skating culture, competitive skating, which is sort of like figure skating, with kind of really, these spectacular outfits and kind of skating to old music.
And this organ that caught your eye, I believe it's a Wurlitzer from the mid-20s, right?
Right, yeah.
What was that for? When did it get played? Before you showed up on the scene?
originally lived at the Broadway Theater, which was downtown in Portland. And these organs were made, all across the country by Wurlitzer, but they were put in different silent movie theaters. So essentially every kind of, bigger town or city had a theater organ at their movie theater, with the whole idea being that a single organist could perform a score, an accompaniment to the silent films as they toured through the country, which is, part of what makes the organ so amazing is that not only does it have the regular pipe sounds that a sort of church organ would have, but it also has percussion sounds, which play actual instruments. So, it's a real marimba, a real glockenspiel. All of those are being played or are available to the performer, as well as sound effects, like the sound of a bird chirping or ocean waves crashing, which are all these mechanical little instruments up in the stacks. But the idea was that the organist, if it was an outdoor scene, he could, reach his toe over and hit the button that would make the bird chirp to kind of accentuate the film and add sound effects and basically Foley the film live.
This is something that someone who is not that familiar with the technology of those days, would understand. Now, just to clarify a little bit, you gave a bit of an explanation, and it was a good one. It was more than I knew, but you see these organs, and it's kind of stylized on the cover art of your album. They'll have these tabs you press down, I believe, to select a different sound. And like we play keyboards today, we'll play our Casio keyboards we got for $75 at the Radio Shack, and they'll have a variety of sounds, and we know how they make them. They're on a chip, they're in the memory, but this had for all these things, it had actual devices, and the percussion played like literally percussive instruments bolted onto the thing?
Yeah, literally percussive instruments bolted on. I think the bird whistle is kind of like the ones that you can fill with water and blow into, and it has a sort of a whistle underwater that makes it gurgle and sound like a bird. All of the instruments are physically hanging there with the pipes. So, and it's all pneumatically controlled, which means that you're just sending, by pressing down a key, you're sending a burst of air to whatever instrument, and that's what's causing the instrument to make a sound. If it's a percussion instrument, that air would trigger, a hammer that would hit the keys. Yeah, this instrument had a lot of percussion stuff, which I really used a lot of that on the album. But there's other ones that are even more elaborate. I think some of them have pianos that are kind of suspended as well, and you can play a piano from the organ keyboard. It's pretty amazing and advanced technology for that era, but it's also sort of an accessible technology, I think, as opposed to you're just describing the Casio keyboard. An electronic chip like that, we all know that the sounds are in there, but how they're in there would take a really extreme expert to explain, and it would be really complicated explanation. Whereas with this organ, it's fairly simple. It's something that I think a lot of people could grasp if they just spent 10 minutes talking about it with somebody.
With the organ, you just essentially have to visually look at how it's set up, right? Or is this something you can't really see?
Oh, there's a few things you can't see, but most of it is pretty exposed. The only complicated thing is how it switches between the instruments, which it does. It's old electromagnetic switching, so it's like copper wires that send the signals to tell it to change to whichever instrument, depending on which one of those colored tabs that you push down. But even that is, it's fairly simple in comparison to kind of some piece of silicone that's programmed.
Hearing about how this whole organ works and how everything is attached and how everything controls all these other things, I imagine that I don't know how much you had to deal with this or ever have had to with these sorts of things, but the maintenance on this device must be hellacious.
Yeah, well, it is. In making this album, I spent a fair amount of time with Keith Fortune, who I mentioned before, who's sort of the head organist and also the caretaker of the organ, and has been for, I think, about 15 years. We spent a lot of time together doing repairs to the organ. I kind of, as as a trade. You know, I immediately offered to do repairs when I first got in touch with him. I called him and sort of explained what I wanted to do musically, and then I said, you know, if you need it to do any repairs, I'd be happy to help. And he said, well, great, you know, because you're absolutely right that the instrument is in constant need of maintenance. He's essentially always fixing it. You know, it's all made out of, there's a lot of like these leather pouches, and the leather wears out, and you use animal hide glue to re-glue the leather. So there's a lot of using these sort of old world techniques to be able to keep it maintained. And the copper wiring, the electromagnetic switches, they wear out. Especially, it's kind of close to the river, so with the humidity from the water, a lot of things get corroded faster than they would somewhere else, maybe. So, yeah, it's kind of a constant, constantly being fixed. But you know, that was part of the fun for me, to be able to get more intimate with the instrument and be able to kind of have a closer look at how it was working.
We should back up a little bit. So the first time you saw this thing, this 20s Wurlitzer organ, now your affinity for old technology is well documented. It's right there on your website, in fact. So was this the sort of thing you just made a beeline straight toward?
Well, like I said, I mean, when I first saw it, it was, you know, I didn't really even know it was there. I just had a friend who had invited me to come to his roller skating birthday party, which was kind of funny. So I went over there and went to this skating rink, and I'd been to Oaks Park, but not to the rink. When I saw it, I was immediately just totally impressed with it, and I kind of knew in the back of my mind that I'd like to do a project with it, because, like you said, I've been interested in older technologies, and you know, it just is so incredible looking and sounding that I knew that I wanted to do something, but I didn't really have an idea in mind, and I was busy with other things, so it kind of took a while for me to sort of figure out, yeah, I really should work on that project and do something around the organ.
Now, we know that you called up this fellow, Keith, who helped you learn the trade of repairing the organ, but how did you eventually approach the idea of doing some musical project with this? Because, of course, I myself would probably be afraid that they would deny me access to what's essentially an elaborate mechanical antique. Was that an easy or a difficult thing? I mean, did you just have to offer to help with repairs, and you were kind of in to experiment with it, or what?
In the course of doing some projects like this, I've sort of worked with several antique instruments and had to sort of navigate relationships with people that know more about these instruments than me and that caretake these instruments. And generally, people are fairly excited to talk about them. Once you can kind of get past, you know, the door, they're totally ready to talk. Surprisingly, almost everybody that I've dealt with has been fairly responsive to my music, even though I'm not really coming from sort of a preservation standpoint or a traditional approach as they are. I think, you know, in the case of Keith, he's so enthusiastic about the organ itself that sort of anybody using it and sort of promoting it is good for him. And he, you know, and in this sense, he also, I think, was really excited to have it kind of be used in a much more modern way. I think he was curious as to what I was going to do and how it was going to turn out. So I think that there's an element of that as well, and sort of people being excited about seeing how these instruments can be transformed.
So when you play your existing music for a keeper of an old instrument that you want to have access to, they generally think, despite the fact that your music has a much newer feel to it than anything anybody would hear produced with these older instruments, they're still pretty jazzed about it?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, sometimes they don't know exactly how to respond. He's definitely, he appreciated it. I think it was a stretch for him to kind of find his place and how to listen to it. He was really excited about like trying to hear like exactly what I'd used from the organ in the album. So he was I think that was kind of a really exciting thing for him to try to discover, what sound is that and how did you get that sound out of the organ. It let him think about the organ in a different way, and I think, he's excited for that.
Now, when you were embarking on the project, how much did you know, or I should phrase this, how clear an idea did you have of how you were going to use the sounds of the Wurlitzer? How much did you know in advance how you were going to treat the sounds as they came out on Oaks, the final album?
I didn't really know. The way that I've been working is I'll make some recordings of the instrument. I recorded a lot of the singular percussion sounds, and then I would just sort of improvise and kind of sketch out some ideas, just playing the instrument live and sort of looking for little idiosyncratic things that would add a color or something that would attract me that I knew that I could go back and do something with in a studio setting. I sort of initially just kind of make this really raw recording and then bring it back into my studio space, and I work pretty intuitively in that, I don't really know what the outcomes are going to be before I start working. So it creates this sense of sort of continual discovery, and I'm sort of just exploring how things could sound and trying all these different techniques to change the sound until I kind of arrive somewhere that sounds right or that feels right, and then I let that sit and I sort of develop other sounds around it, and that's sort of my process. It's almost like an interaction, I feel like, with the instrument and with the studio technology, in the sense that I feel very guided by what's existing in raw form, and that I'm almost just responding to that.
It's a very much, you'd call it maybe an iterative, organic sort of process where you're as surprised as a listener is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, in certain ways. Often I don't know how I got from like A to B because I kind of work quickly and I'm just sort of following this idea, and I don't even know necessarily how I arrived where I did. And that's just how I've worked, and it's just the way that I work, I guess. I think it's exciting and it keeps things changing and new, and that's what I like.
I should ask this question for listeners who aren't that familiar with studio methods now. How much of this was just simply collecting the sounds of the organ, going there, getting whatever sounds you could, recording them, and then bringing them back to your studio and putting them together, versus how much was there, if any, actual playing as we would know it of the organ and recording that playing? I guess the issue is recording playing versus recording distinct sounds and then making those play in the studio, if that's
right.
Clear at all.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It was a mixture of those things. In some cases I would just hit a single note, and then I would be able to use that single note as raw material. And I kind of, went through and chose some different notes on some different instruments and did that, so I would have that as a palette to choose from. But then I also just play it, sort of improvise on it, and make recordings of that, and use those to grab from as well. Because the organ itself you can layer in all these really amazing ways. It has 4 sets of keyboards, and there's so many instruments, so that on one keyboard I can have tuned sleigh bells and a marimba, and on another one I can have a glockenspiel and a tambourine, and I can just kind of play all of those sounds together and create these really interesting textures and sort of very simple melodic statements. And I'll often do that for a while, record those sorts of things, and grab those as well. But this kind of differed. This was sort of the first time that I'd interacted in that way, at least as far as an album goes, with the instrument. And before I worked with the theater organ, I had done stuff only with automated instruments as far as my albums and compositions went. I was only working with player pianos, music boxes, and a tuned church bell system that was automated as well. And in those cases, I didn't play the instrument at all I did was removed notes from an existing composition, essentially pick, for instance, the music box, I pulled the tines back so that only 3 or 4 notes played instead of 20 notes playing. And that created these really sparse compositions where the mechanical aspects of the instrument in the recordings become very important and hold almost equal weight to the melodic aspects that are happening. That was kind of where I came from. And in this recording, I was sort of trying to approach it with that same simple approach, except instead this time I actually was playing the instrument and looking for, like I was saying, these sort of idiosyncratic, like, if there's one key, for instance, that's supposed to play a sleigh bell, but that particular sleigh bell is like maybe cracked and it just sounds a little bit different, then I'm interested in exploiting these sort of inconsistencies, grabbing and gathering those and having those be a lot of what creates the final pieces. I don't know, I hope that in some way answers your question. I think it's a mixture of looking for raw single notes as well as playing these little improvised ideas.
Now let's give the audience a little bit of a taste of the album Oaks. Here is the flow released. And that was the flow released from Ethan Rose's new album, Oaks. And so are we hearing purely treated Wurlitzer recording on that, or is there anything else there?
No, yeah, that's purely the Wurlitzer. Everything on the whole album is all sourced from that Wurlitzer at Oaks Park.
And how much experience, we said before the song, we were talking about how you'd previously used player pianos and music boxes as instruments. How much traditional experience did you have with keyboard instruments before the recording of this album?
Oh, a fair amount. I studied music in college, so I had I have had a fair amount of musical experience and in terms of playing, and I've played in several bands and played keyboards. I'm not really a very proficient keyboard player, but I can play. That said, I'm not really interested in proficiency in that sense, or at least in any sort of technical prowess on an instrument. That's not really my musical interest. I think, with these other instruments in the albums preceding Oaks, sort of what that was really exciting for me about those albums and about that way of approaching music was this sort of letting go of the idea of being a performer or having to play something, to just kind of let the instrument play itself and sort of interact with the instrument, reducing what it's doing and sort of gently guiding what it's doing, but in a lot of ways letting it exist in its own space and create its own piece. That, for me, was just a really liberating way to work. Having only done sort of more traditional songwriting and composition stuff before that, it kind of represented this whole new way of looking at music, which I thought, for me personally, which was really exciting.
Was that more of a sudden revelation to you that you could do that? You could step back, take yourself out of the picture as a player a little bit and more as a curator, or was it a journey kind of toward that point that you had been moving toward that whole time?
I've been working on experimental music and doing sort of improvisational music with different people and with myself, and I think that I was looking for something like that, but that would be more structured, that would kind of be more interesting. So I think I was sort of looking for it, but not very consciously. And then essentially how it happened is there used to be an old surplus store here in Portland called Wacky Willie's that had like medical surplus and science surplus and then just electrical junk sort of stuff. It was a great store. I went in there 7 or 8 years ago and found about 20 music boxes that actually had little AC motors on them, so you plugged them into the wall and they played. And I just bought them. They were fairly cheap, and I brought them home and just wanted to do something with them. And that was, I guess, for me, the first project where I thought about what I could do, and I started just bending back the tines and changing their melodies, and then I made recordings of them in this new state and made a piece out of that, and that sort of like put me on this track and got me excited about thinking of music in this respect where it's this sort of responsive interaction with the materials, and so I went on, from there I said, well, how can I do this on a larger scale? What other ways can I work? What other instruments can I work with? And player pianos were an easy step because it's essentially a larger music box. Although obviously it's a piano and it plays a paper roll instead of a little metal barrel that spins. So that created a whole new kind of sound world, which was really great. The sounds of the tactile sounds of the paper spinning and kind of squeaking, and all of the mechanical thumping that happens to drive the pneumatics of the piano. And in that case, I just took a paper roll and taped off most of the notes on the roll. So only, every note that's on one of those player piano rolls is a note. So by taping most of them off, you get these much sparser compositions that, similar to the music boxes, let the mechanical sounds really come out. That it's this idea of melodic and textured sound that I'm really interested in, and that has really attracted me. And and from there, it's gone on to the church bell system, which is essentially an enormous music box and an application of the same sort of ideas. And then this organ piece, which is interesting because it's kind of grown out of these automated instruments into an instrument that isn't automated but is historic and is really interesting in its own right. I think with our sort of obsession today with sampling and these keyboards that can play 500 different sounds, here's essentially the originator of that, which is kind of lost. I didn't know about it, and I don't think a lot of people do know about it. It's sort of the first sampler, except for that all the instruments are real and they're really there.
For those just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. Consult our website, colinmarshallradio.com, and you'll find our complete interview archive as well as other podcasts and more. My guest is electro-acoustic musician and old technology enthusiast Ethan Rose. His new album is called Oaks. And you found the music boxes at Wacky Willie's, and you found the Wurlitzer while going to a friend's skating birthday party. And was this one of those sort of incongruous, maybe semi-ironic, little too old for it skating parties?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah, you'd have to know my friend, but yeah, I don't know how much irony necessarily was involved, but it was certainly just kind of like a fun thing, a crazy fun thing to do. He had been there as a kid, so he knew about the organ and the whole experience.
With the other examples of old technology you've used or have been fascinated by, are they similarly things that you have stumbled upon, or do you seek these things out? I mean, do you go on road trips looking for old stuff, or do you just kind of happen to find them like those two?
Well, it's a mixture. I mean, with those two, it was definitely just kind of happening to find them. But with the player piano, like I said, I had finished the music box piece, and I really wanted to do something with another instrument in a similar fashion. And I thought of player pianos. A friend of mine said, "Oh, there's this great store in town that has all these player pianos. You should go there." This old sort of dusty piano store called the Immortal Piano Company. And that place is really a great spot in its own right. But they let me come in and play with their pianos and make recordings of the pianos there. So in that case, I had seeked out an instrument. The same thing happened with the church bell system, which is located on Stanford campus. It's the only automated church bell system in the U.S. But as a technology, most of that stuff is over in Europe. It was some of the earliest automated systems, dating back to the 14th century, and these big church towers and essentially these enormous sort of drums that you plug pegs into, and you spin this drum around, and the pegs hit ropes that chime the bells. That's this other really old technology, and I kind of did some research because I'd heard about them. And I did some research and found the only one in the States, which is at Stanford. And I did make a trip down there to make recordings of that instrument. And that's on my album, Spinning Pieces, which actually is a collection of 3 pieces. One is the player piano, one is featuring music boxes, and one featuring the church bells.
At the beginning of the segment of your musical career where you began using these sort of devices that play themselves, you might say, did you have any examples that you looked to of musicians or sound artists who did not necessarily the same thing, but sort of took themselves out of the playing space and made their role a little more of a broader one? Maybe I don't know what you'd even call it, but was there anybody who was particularly inspirational to you in that regard, or was this kind of a role you had to invent for yourself?
I think there's so many people that have done things that are inspirational or even that I'm not aware of that are exploring territories that may be similar. So I think for me, it's been more of a personal thing. I'm obviously aware of like John Cage and his use of like chance and accident in music, and certainly that I think has just been majorly influential on our culture, and certainly has influenced how I have thought about music and sound, and in some ways I think informs. There's this sense of chance that's existing in the music that I'm working on. So, his work definitely, you can't not mention it. And also, I was really attracted to and interested in like American minimalism, especially Steve Reich's music, who works a lot with phasing and composes very melodic music, which, up until the minimalists, so much music had been very dissonant and atonal. And I think there's a place for that kind of music as well, but I'm more attracted to some melodies, and at least the potential for melodies. I feel like those Steve Reich and the minimalists were also pretty influential on me in terms of thinking just sonically about how I would want things to be composed. And then, it just turned out that these instruments sort of fulfilled all of these ideas and allowed for me to let things be melodic but not be too tightly controlled, and also really introduced like a textured sort of noise element to the sound, which I think is just as interesting as the melodic part, and sort of just as important as it.
How much do you think that being on the more melodic side of what we'll call the avant-garde and being someone who uses sonic textures that often get called, I mean, there are words like, warm, and they even go so far as to say, friendly in some reviews. How does this, do you think, maybe make your relationship with your audience differ from an electronic composer whose work is perhaps a bit harsher? I don't know if you have many points of comparison, but does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I think ultimately I'm not that concerned with my audience in that sense. I'm not necessarily writing music for an audience, but I'm definitely writing music for me and for what I would want to hear as an audience. I'm essentially the audience that I'm writing for, and I think that especially with the kind of music that I'm making, I really do in a lot of ways serve as an audience, because I'm just watching the instrument go and, like I said, sort of interacting with a lot of the materials that I work with. But that said, I think that there's an accessibility that just happens in what I'm doing, and I guess that is is attractive, and I think it's part of just who I am, and the work that I want to do. So it's sort of born out of that. Like I said, I'm definitely interested in listening to a lot of different types of music, and I'll listen to things that are a lot less accessible, and I can definitely enjoy that kind of work, but it's not really the work that I'm interested in making, at least at this point.
Let's hear one more excerpt from Oaks. Here is Scenes from When. That was Scenes from When from Ethan Rose's new album, Oaks. Now, another word that comes up often in the write-ups of this album, at least it comes up often in the discussions that I've seen on blogs and what have you, is the word nostalgic. I don't know if that's a word that you apply in your own head to it, or is that a surprise to hear?
Well, it's certainly been applied a lot. It's not really a surprise. I don't know. I mean, I think that in terms of words describing music, it's always a funny thing. You know, I think a lot of the idea of music is to sort of push beyond the expression of words. It's always funny to hear the words that get pulled out. But I can understand that, I guess, on certain levels. I think that I sort of need a kind of emotional resonance with my music for it to feel right. I guess that can come off as a sort of a nostalgic emotional state or feeling or something. I don't really know, but I guess I just make it with sort of, I just make it to sound right to me, and then it goes out into the world and people call it what they will, I guess. That's the only way for me to really think about it or deal with it.
Right. It is kind of funny. I mean, hearing nostalgic come up so much, but listening to the album, I mean, just for me, myself, it seems like there's, sure, you can say nostalgic. I mean, no one's going to argue that down, but again, it doesn't seem quite right, because that feels like it's going to be a tribute to an era when there's really not. I don't really get a sense of a single time period from the album. It's not as if you're paying tribute to the era of this Wurlitzer or specifically the glory days of the Oaks rink, right?
Yeah, I mean, at least not like very directly. I think that parts of that are probably in there somewhere, but they're fairly buried. And you know, I think all of those things inform the music. You know, for instance, the fact that it's at a roller skating rink is just kind of it's really just a byproduct of a situation. You know, the instrument wasn't built for roller skating. It was built for silent film scoring, and it just kind of ended up at the rink because, well, it's a great place to have it, and people can skate to it, and you know, it sort of just worked out that way. But that then leads to the fact that me being there and recording it and sort of witnessing all this roller skating activity. And I think in certain ways, you know, that helps to inform the album in ways that I'm not even necessarily fully conscious of. That's always interesting, you know, for me, is sort of this blurry line between, you know, what my own intentions are and then what sort of the just inherent qualities of the space or the instrument are, and how those two kind of merge and inform each other and change, and that really is what leads to the final product of the album. In this case, the skating, when I don't know if you knew about this, but when we did a CD release party at the rink, you know, I kind of had thought a lot about how I wanted to do that, and thought about different ways to do that, and eventually just decided that the best way to do it would be to just have people roller skate, which was really fun and totally bizarre and kind of surreal experience, I think, for everyone. And I didn't really know how that would turn out or how people would react, but it turns out that it's a really good album to roller skate to. Well, I think it's just people were kind of very gracefully moving around the rink in this sort of slow motion, and it's very fluid, and I think there's a kind of fluidity to the music as well, you know, reacting and giving them the chance to listen to music like this and not just have to sit and listen, to be able to listen and move, because it's not necessarily music that inspires, you know, a dance party or something, or dancing in any way. But if you're roller skating to it, you find a movement that works to it, and I thought that was really kind of fun and interesting to win this.
I'd never thought about it before you just brought it up, but yeah, really the idea that you can do stuff to the more ambient side of the musical spectrum is pretty foreign to people. It's actually pretty foreign to me. I never really thought much about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally music is for, there's kind of two camps for music. It's either for sitting and listening to or dancing to, and there's some blurry lines, but it's fun to watch those lines get totally reversed, And this was a case where people were suddenly allowed to move, and there was a lot of energy in the space. It's not always the case in a concert of seated people. You don't necessarily get this kind of charged energy. You can, but not in the same way, not in like a physical way. So it was really, really fun, and I'm kind of glad that I decided to go in that direction. It was one of those things where, like, how many opportunities am I going to have in my life to have people roller skate to my music? Sort of felt like I needed to do it.
I want to ask how far back in your own life your interest in old technology goes, but is it an interest specifically in old musical technology, or is this something separable from your interest in music? Do you just happen to have these two parallel interests?
I mean, I've always been a little bit interested in this kind of like gadgetry and inventions, but it's always been really like, tactile things. I remember being young and making some really like complicated way to pulleys in my room where I could pull a string and turn on my radio, pull a different string and turn on my lights. And so it's like, it's Rube Goldberg style of just like kind of tying things together. And I used to have fun with that as a kid, but I was never really very like techie or mathy to be able to really deal with electronics. I was more interested in things that I could just put my hands on and play with and understand, in a more immediate way. And I think that's part of my attraction to these instruments. But I think, part of why I've gotten interested in them is that isn't necessarily because I have a love of old instruments or old technology. It's more because in these old instruments and in the old technology, I've discovered a way for me to explore a different part of music or craft than I would have if I hadn't found them. In some ways, they're sort of a means to an end, in the sense that, I appreciate them and love them and think they're really interesting, but I'm more interested in the final product than I am in the actual instrument. I think that shows in the fact that the recordings aren't the recordings of a preservationist. I'm not interested in preserving the instrument. I understand that, and I am interested in it because I think what Keith Fortune does is great, and that I hope people continue to play that organ far into the future in a traditional way, but that's just not what I'm interested in.
You're trying to achieve a sound then, and how you get to that sound is less consequential than what that sound ends up being.
Yeah, it is consequential, but it's not the most important part of the equation by any means. And as I've continued to work and as I'll continue to work, I think I will sort of the experiences that I've developed through working with these instruments will help guide my compositional strategies into the future. And for instance, I just did a sound installation up in Alaska with this design group called Molo Design, and it was a really great Freeze Festival. They did this outdoor installation and made this sort of snow, like an enclosed snow space, and I put up speakers and filled it with sound. And there I had to use, I had a week up there to write a piece, and I used field recordings from the environment, and I also I played with the materials. I recorded the sounds of icicles dripping, and just the snow. I brought the snow into the studio and was recording, rubbing it around and playing with it. And I think, I'm with that. I'm bringing the same sense of sort of reacting to material that I've been able to do with these instruments. Whereas I'm sort of letting the space, the geography, the weather conditions, the material guide the piece in the same sense that the player piano or the music box guided the piece.
I wish I had another hour just to ask about that project. That's that's something that I feel like there's a million things I could ask about that, but the time is running a little low. I wanted to make sure to ask about one more thing, which is that your music appeared in my favorite film of 2008, Gus Van Sant's Paranoid Park. How did that come about?
Essentially, I just got a call from the producers in the film, and they said that Gus Van Sant was interested in using some of my music for the new movie that he was working on, and I think Gus had just kind of discovered my work. He lives in Portland, and I think he's really good about kind of looking at Portland and always sort of keeping an eye here to see what's happening. And he had just happened to look at a write-up on my work and was interested and got the CD, and he just felt like it really tied into his film, and there's sort of this Northwest quality in some ways to the music he felt drawn to, and likewise Molo, the design company, they're from Vancouver. The people that I worked with in Alaska, they're from Vancouver, BC, and they also were drawn to this sort of Northwest quality. I think it's just, a little bit of pride of being up here and being in this area and the sort of work that goes on. And so, yeah, I don't know. He had just kind of come across it and felt like it fit, and I was obviously really honored to be a part of that and have him use my music. I've been a fan of his since I was a kid, so it was a pretty humbling experience.
I did totally feel I used to live up around Seattle, so I did feel the Northwestiness there of the combination of your music and, of course, of the film itself. And it sounds like the answer to this is yes from what you've already said, but I feel like I should ask a real-life Portland resident, not just a Portland fan like myself. Was that a movie, then, that really rooted itself in the city as opposed to using it as simply a backdrop?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Gus is really good at capturing, he has this really poetic quality to his work, and I think that is, he really can really capture a place, and I think it really, in that film, it really came across, he really captured sort of just the feel of Portland, at least through a certain lens, and it's a great film, beautifully photographed, and yeah, like I said, I was really, really happy to have been a part of it.
In any case, the new album, once again, is called Oaks. Ethan, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks to you. Appreciate it.
If you'd like to know more about Ethan Rose and his music, visit ethanrosemusic.com. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. For our complete interview archive, as well as other podcasts and more, just visit colinmarshallradio.com. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of what he does at benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.